of trafficked victims are adults according to UNODC. The largest number of victims according to UNODC are adult women at 49%, and according to the ILO, 55%. We also see that children, that adults are trafficked. If we look at the UNODC data and we look at the 4 subregions, we see that adults are the main victims of trafficking in 3 of these subregions. Also, if we look at UNODC data, we'll see that about a third of the victims of trafficking, 34%, are trafficked domestically, 37% are cross-border from the same region, an additional 3% are from nearby subregions, and only 26% are trafficked transnationally or to regions further away. And I looked at these general patterns of trafficking, and you can come to one conclusion, and that is the fact that global aggregate figures obscure significant regional differeces. So I began looking at some of these regional differences to see if there were particular factors that we could use we could look at to understand why in a certain region these patterns different. If we look at adult and child victims, we see that in Europe and Central Asia, 82% of the victims are adults. In the Americas, it's 69%. In South Asia, East Asia, and the Pacific, 64%. And then we see an unusual pattern, and that is that in Africa and the Middle East, only 38% of the victims are adults, 62% of the victims are children. If we look at trafficking patterns in terms of domestic and cross-border trafficking, we see that most trafficking is from within the same region, but if we look at the Middle East and North Africa, we see that 67% of the victims are, 67% of identified victims come from outside of the region. So I want to spend some time today talking about these 2 unusual patterns. Why do we see so many children trafficked in, and I focus on Central and West Africa? Why do we see so many victims, identified victims, trafficked transnationally into the Middle East or the Gulf states? And I identified one other pattern of human trafficking, and that's domestic child trafficking in Afghanistan. I saw a documentary on a particular practice called Bacha Bazi. This is a form of sexual abuse of young boys in Afghanistan. And in the 15 years that I have been working in the area of human trafficking, I have never seen this pattern of trafficking in any other country in the world. There's very little research, academic research, that's been done on this, and when I begin explaining the phenomena, you'll understand why. But I wanted to highlight this as well, too. If we look at child trafficking victims, I wanted to focus on Central and West Africa, but if we look at child trafficking victims in Sub-Saharan Africa, we see that Sub-Saharan Africa has the largest percentage of child labor of any other region in the world. 25%, almost a little bit more than 25% of all children in Sub-Saharan Africa are found in child labor. If we concentrate then on West and Central Africa, we'll see that it affects 70% of the countries in this particular region. And I want to look at why this might be so. There are a number of explanations for why child trafficking is so prevalent in this particular region. One explanation could be that trafficking of persons in this region or countries in this region define trafficking only as it applies to child labor. Another explanation could be attributed to the fact that a large population, in this area, 41% of the population is under the age of 15. And if we compare this to globally, 26% of children are under the age of 14 or under the age of 15. So Africa has a huge, sub-Saharan Africa has a huge population of children at risk. Another explanation that has been given to explain child trafficking in this region is the AIDS pandemic, which left many children either orphaned or ostracized. And this, of course, also puts them at great risk. But there are other factors that I think are specific to this region and to this phenomena of child trafficking. If you look at this region, you'll see two different and distinct forms of child trafficking. One of them is domestic child trafficking for forced labor in many legitimate sectors. So we're talking about the fishing industry, agriculture, forced labor on markets, working on buses, etc. And the other is the sexual exploitation of young girls and young women, either in their own country, trans-regionally, or transnationally, internationally. What are some of the factors that contribute to this problem? Number one is poverty. If we look at UNDP's, the United Nations Development Programme's Development Index, 35 of 43 countries ranked low on this development index are in Africa. If we look at the countries that are ranked the lowest, the countries ranked number 170 to 187 on this UNDP Development Index are located in Africa. So 18 of these countries scoring lowest are in Africa. Many of the participants this morning have already talked about a direct link between poverty and human trafficking. Another factor that contributes to the high rate of child trafficking in this region is polygamy. Many of the families from which these children are trafficked are polygamous families. Clearly, it's not that polygamy causes human trafficking, but the fact that polygamous families are very often large, and there's a large number of children in these families. Polygamous families are very often found in rural areas, which are the poorest areas of these countries. It's a common practice that if a man dies, his brother is obligated to marry the widow and also take care of his brother's children. And it's not unusual. We were doing one of the first projects I worked on for the United Nations on trafficking was in West Africa, and NGOs are telling us that it's not uncommon to find families with 13 to 15 children. And clearly they cannot educate and feed these children, so what they do is they will give these children to be placed with other families to learn skills or to be educated. This brings me to another explanation that has been directly related to child trafficking in West and Central Africa, and that is the cultural practice of child fosterage. Children are considered to be a link between families and the extended families, and it's not unusual for families, even families with a small number of children, to place these children in wealthier families that have promised to give these children an education, to teach them domestic skills, and to teach them work. So consequently, it's the historical and cultural practice of child fosterage which doesn't cause human trafficking, but it certainly can facilitate human trafficking. This child fosterage system is also used to strengthen the extended family solidarity, and it's believed that work teaches children social values. Another factor that has been contributed to or linked to child trafficking in this area is gender inequality, and that's also been something that's been mentioned before. In many countries, girls are devalued. Limited resources will be invested in boys, so girls may be placed in families to work so that what limited resources a family has can be invested in the education of male children. Girls are considered to be of less value because once they marry, they leave the family. Girls tend to be more malleable. they tend to be more willing to sacrifice for their families and to be more obedient. Mike Dottridge, who's done extensive work on child trafficking, argues that this is the reason why it's much easier to traffic girls. They're much easier to control than boys are. Another thing that he attributes to the problem, or let's say the discrimination against girls, is early marriage and the fact that women are not allowed to inherit family land. So the fact that women are ostracized, that they are denied education and they are denied equal jobs or access to the job market means that they're much more willing to take risks to travel abroad. Some of the factors that we see that encourage families to place their girl children in situations of domestic service are also the same factors that we see that facilitate the trafficking of young women into sexual exploitation. One of the things that I address in the paper, and this is something that's really limited to only certain countries, is the mechanism that's used to control women in forced prostitution from West African countries, and in particular from Nigeria. Unlike other practices that are used, and that's usually force or some sort of control or psychological control, what law enforcement and what NGOs have told us about the control used by Nigerian traffickers is this practice of voodoo or juju, in which the young girl is a service, a voodoo service is performed on this young girl before she departs. A piece of clothing, an intimate piece of clothing, a hair clipping, fingernail clippings are used, and the girls are told that a curse has been put on them, and if they turn on their traffickers or if they try to escape, harm will come to their families or to them. And Italian police and Dutch police report that these women are so frightened that it's not even necessary to lock them up or take their documents, that they simply are too afraid to cooperate with law enforcement investigations. So this is, of course, another cultural practice that should be understood when we're trying to understand this phenomena of trafficking. I identify in this paper intermediate and deep structural causes in the trafficking of children and young women from this region. Intermediate causes, of course, are much more easy to address. These are, for instance, the failure of parents to recognize the dangers to their children of placing them in situations with other families without supervision. Another intermediate factor would be a lack of school opportunities for girls. If we have schools, then we should open them up to girls as well as boys. And of course, another intermediate factor would be the lack of job opportunities in rural areas. But what's more difficult to address, and you'll see this in the other two cases that I address as well too, are deep structural causes. And these are gender discrimination against women. These are the belief, the long-term continuing belief in child fosterage, the idea that it's okay to place your children in unsupervised situations with families that are unknown to you. Massive structural debt is a problem that is not going to be solved quickly or easily. And the last factor is systematic government corruption, which facilitates human trafficking. I want to turn now from child trafficking in West and Central Africa to another pattern of trafficking, and Michaela de Kock mentioned this in her presentation, and this is trafficking of foreign workers to the Gulf states. This was the second unusual trafficking pattern that I identified because it involves moving people from Southeast Asia, from South Asia, halfway across the world and exploiting them in labor in the Middle East and the Gulf states. I looked specifically at the Gulf Cooperation Council states, and these are Bahrain, Kuwait, Iraq, Oman, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates. For the purpose that you'll see in the paper, I have some more statistics. I have left Iraq out because it's a little bit unusual in this group of Gulf states. What contributes, or let's say, to what can we account this large migration of foreign workers to this area? The discovery in 1950 of oil led to a rapid population growth in this area and something that has not been seen anywhere else in the world. The population of this area increased from 4 million in the 1950s to 40 million in 2011. And this was not, of course, due to a natural population growth, but to a huge influx of foreign workers. Many of these workers came from the SAARC countries, the South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation, and these are the countries of Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, the Maldives, Nepal, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka. I do have to apologize to my Filipino colleagues sitting here in the room. I know that there are a large number of migrant workers from the Philippines coming to the Middle East, and actually many of them participated in the first study that we did with UNICRI. And the reason why I have not addressed this is for the following. On my sabbatical, I did research in Nepal, and I talked to people from NGOs and the government, and their comment was, we don't have the means to protect our foreign workers as the Philippines do. That having been said, I think that the Philippines government has a much stronger lobbying group, a longer history of protecting their migrant workers. The Nepalis are very envious of that. But I'm not denying the fact that there is a problem of abuse of Filipinos definitely in this area. But I have decided to concentrate on these SAARC countries because I think politically they're much, much weaker. And that I've concentrated on them for that reason. Foreign workers make up between 51% of all workers in Saudi Arabia to as many as 94% of all workers in Qatar. Many of males are, of course, in construction. And initially, when foreign workers began being imported into this country, they were imported into the construction area, into construction work. And as the countries began growing, there was more and more of a need for other services to be provided. And then we started seeing the import of women into these countries to work in domestic service. I don't have to tell you about the severe human rights abuses that are going on. If you type in Middle East or you type in Qatar and foreign workers, you can read story after story of horrific human rights abuses. The Nepali government told me we go to the airport every single day and pick up coffins of migrant workers that are dying there. There are cases of abuses of workers being forced to work for extremely long hours in 100-degree heat, in 50-degree Celsius heat, no breaks, long working hours. Domestic workers are locked in homes. If they're not being abused in terms of the number of hours that they're having to work and the food that they're being provided and the rest they're being provided, many of these young women are subjected to sexual assault by the males of the household. It's a very, very serious problem regardless of what area of work foreign workers are in. But I want to identify two reasons, or let's say two factors that have been directly related to the abuse of and the trafficking of migrant workers into this area. First of all, many of the workers coming into the Middle East are non-Muslims. And there is a very, very strong mistrust and marginalization of foreign workers, particularly non-Muslim foreign workers. Non-Muslim foreign workers are perceived as a threat to national identity, to the stability, security, and structure of the Gulf states. And in particular, the threat is perceived to come from foreign workers and domestic helpers and babysitters, because these are the ones perceived to be transmitting values from their countries to the children of individuals living in the Gulf states. So there was a fear that was expressed that these foreign workers would not educate children in Islamic and Arabic values. A story that I was told by one of the NGOs working in Nepal was that clearly there's a difference in the educational level of the people employing foreign workers in their household, And many of these foreign workers, these young women, are recruited from rural areas in Nepal. I'm sure this is the same case in the Philippines and many other countries. They're brought into Saudi Arabia. They're told to use the vacuum cleaner to clean the house, and they don't know what a vacuum cleaner is. And when they don't clean the house properly, they're severely beaten for this. So some of it is simply the fact that they're not aware that foreign workers don't understand what they're supposed to do, but a lot of it is mistrust and discrimination against people perceived to be different. Part of this has been exacerbated by disturbances because there have been a number of documented demonstrations by foreign workers that were petitioning for their rights and for better pay and for being paid on time. The other factor that I contribute to the exploitation of foreign workers in the Gulf states is the Kafala system. And this was mentioned in the ILO report. The Kafala system was initially a system that was developed to import foreign workers on a rotation basis. And it was done so that foreign workers would not move to the Gulf states and then establish permanent residency there. The Kafala system gives complete control over the foreign worker to the employer. The employer holds the domestic workers or the foreign workers' passports. The employer determines where the foreign worker works, where the foreign worker lives, the foreign worker, where or if the foreign worker is allowed to quit their job or leave the country or travel. And many of these individuals in extremely abusive situations are not allowed to leave the country because if they do try to leave the country, they are considered in breach of their contract. This makes them an illegal migrant. They will then be arrested and they will be deported at their own cost. Many of these foreign workers incur debts through illicit recruitment agencies before they come, and financially they're not even in a position to leave an exploitative situation until they pay back these debts. The Kafala system creates a structural dependence on the employer. Foreign workers have no right to unionize or to organize. And clearly domestic workers have fewer rights than even foreign workers in the construction industry. And a number of governments, a number of international organizations have called for the abolition or major modifications to the Kafala system. What are some of the approaches that could be taken to protect the rights of foreign workers? Number one, governments in that region could modify or eradicate the Kafala system. Sanctions could be placed and should be placed against illicit recruitment agencies. We need to improve and increase the rights of workers, and that includes the right to unionize and increased pay for their work. It also means that we should protect other basic human rights, such as the right to a limited number of hours of work, not to have to work in extreme heat, to be fed properly, to be housed properly, and to receive medical care. Employees, so foreign workers should be allowed to change jobs, and this should not be the right of the employer. Employers should never be allowed to hold employees' documents. Workers should be allowed to file complaints, which currently is not the case, and it's very important that there's an independent body where they can file complaints. Multinationals must enforce subcontractors' guarantee to protection of workers' rights, and there have been a number of cases in which international companies have subcontracted work out to agencies in this particular region, and foreign workers' rights have been abused, and this is something that has to end. So we need to make sure that we can eradicate trafficking and exploitation within the entire supply chain. And more importantly, and this is a very, very deep structural issue that needs to be addressed, we need to address the discriminatory attitudes towards non-Muslim guest workers. I want to turn now to the last type of trafficking that I identified, the last trend of trafficking that I identified, and that is the practice of Bacha Bazi. This was first identified in the 1970s by a German anthropologist by the name of Baldauf. She identified a practice called Bacha Bazi. Bacha Bazi is the practice of dressing young boys in women's clothing, sometimes forcing them to wear makeup. They're forced to dance at all male parties. And after these wedding parties or other parties, the boys are very often auctioned off to perform sexual services to the highest bidder. This is a practice which has a rather long history in this particular region. It's been identified in Afghanistan and also in parts of Pakistan. Baldauf first identified it in Afghanistan in the 1970s, and it became very prevalent in the 1980s under the Mujahideen warlords to have what they called chai boys. And these were young boys that provided sexual services to these warlords. There have been a number of, the practice of having a boy to provide sexual services has also been documented in Pakistan. It was documented by academicians who were doing work on HIV/AIDS in the country. However, the practice there is somewhat different because it does not involve the dancing and feminization of these young boys. But if we look at the practice and we look at some of the factors that might contribute to this practice, there have been a number that have been identified. Firstly, it's peer pressure. And in this interview with one of the Mujahideen warlords, he tells an investigative journalist that every one of these warlords had a boy, and if you wanted to compete, if you wanted to be part of this group, you also had to have a boy. However, it goes beyond peer pressure, because having a boy or having more of these boys to perform at these parties provides status and power to the men that own them. Poverty is another factor in Afghanistan which contributes to this practice, because many of the boys that are recruited as Bacha Bazi dancers come from very, very poor families. They're either street children or they are recruited from poor families. They're bought in exchange for money. We see some of this also in West Africa, not with this dancing and sexual exploitation of children, but the fact that families are so poor that individuals simply buy or rent the children from the families. So the children become a commodity in exchange for money. Social and cultural practices, which I will get into in just a second, and then, of course, government corruption, which I'll also address. Afghanistan on the UN... Oh, can I do 4... Okay. Let me just address for 5 more minutes. Would that be okay? Okay. What contributes specifically to this practice in Afghanistan? Patriarchy and social exclusion. There is such a strict separation between men and women in this country that young men have absolutely no access whatsoever to women. And having any kind of sexual access to women is seen as something worse than having access to young boys and men. And the separation of women and the complete exclusion of women from social life in Afghanistan has made the practice and the social acceptance of men having contact with young boys much more acceptable, and this has been seen as one of the factors which greatly contributes to this practice. Another is the misrepresentation of the Quran and Islamic law, and in part because the Quran is written in Arabic, and many of the individuals in parts of Afghanistan do not speak Arabic. They speak Pashtun. They don't read Arabic, and they're dependent upon Muslim clerics to interpret the Quran for them. And this Quran has been misinterpreted to the will of the mullah. It has also been misinterpreted because there is a verse in the Quran that says women are unclean during periods of menstruation, and this has been misinterpreted to mean that women are seen as unclean in general, and therefore men would prefer to have sex with young boys rather than with women. Young boys have been praised for their beauty in this country in Pashtun literature for centuries. And a culturally dependent homosexuality has emerged, which places value upon these young boys, and this in turn provides status for its owners. Corruption, and this has been documented by a number of studies that have looked at this practice in the country. Some of the people that are actively involved in this practice are police officers, government officials, high-ranking military officials, which not only have boys of their own, but also hold their hands over and protect powerful business owners that are abusing these boys. I want to take my last minute and I want to draw some conclusions about these three patterns of trafficking that we've seen. Because while they are very, very different, they take place in different parts of the world, they involve different practices, and they involve different victim groups, we do see some common factors that run as a sort of red thread through all of these. And number one, it's poverty. It's poverty in the countries that facilitate the selling of their children and the exploitation of young women and children in forced labor and sexual exploitation. Gender inequality, which puts young girls at greater risk in Africa, and the gender inequality and discrimination actually puts young boys at greater risk in Afghanistan. Discrimination against non-Muslims in the Middle East and the Gulf states puts non-Muslims at greater risk of exploitation in those countries. Government corruption, and if not corruption, at least indifference, and the lack of political will also contributes greatly to this problem. The social and cultural practices are something that are very, very specific to each one of these patterns that I've listed, and I think it's important that we look at trafficking on a very local level, not on a global level, but that we understand the social and cultural practices that facilitate it in specific cities, in specific countries and specific region, and these social and cultural practices need to be addressed before we can really tackle the problem. But lastly, I want to talk about demand, and I think Christina Kangas-Punta pointed that out very, very, very clearly. If there is no demand for the sexual services of young boys in Afghanistan, for foreign nannies in the Middle East, for children cleaning up people's homes in West African countries, if we do not generate a demand, there will be no exploitation of human trafficking of these victims. Thank you very much for your attention.